Hello. Thank you guys for tuning in to the last lecture of this semester for History 1001. We're going to be doing our last lecture today, and then I will be posting another lecture, or not a lecture, but I'll be posting kind of a discussion over the final and the review that I'll be providing. So that'll be a different lecture. So don't tune into the end of this one for that. Okay. So we are going to start. This is about 2 centuries. We're going to be covering 1300s and some of the 1400s as well with this. And I've mentioned this before, but in the 800s to about the 1200s, Europe was going through what we call the medieval warm period, which enabled a number of things to occur as a result of the warmer, predictable weather. Populations grew, and thus the need for more food to feed that population forced land to be brought under cultivation that normally wouldn't have been as desirable, even if it wasn't quality land that was needed to be planted. It was needed, and so we have like marshes being drained, forests being cleared, fens and swamps being cleared up, rocky and sandy soil was coaxed to grow. And the weather was predictable enough that peasants' lives revolved around the planting and harvesting seasons, and these 4 centuries were pretty predictable for them. The warmer weather also enabled the exploration of new areas that were colonized by the Vikings, as we've discussed before. Those higher water levels allowed their boats to go further up rivers and deeper into areas like Iceland. The Crusaders even were able to go into the Middle East because there was some more predictable weather going on there, especially since we have larger populations. So we have more second and third and fourth sons that are looking for lands. So that need for exploration and the finding of new lands is really important as well. The agricultural world that I mentioned before about how the peasants are clearing a lot more land, that all goes into the whole manorial system. And because the weather was better, because we had more predictable weather, there was less pushback against this manorial system as well. But we will see later in this lecture that doesn't continue forever. So starting in around the beginning of the 1300s in Northern Europe, but starting in around 1200 in the Arctic, we start to see a new type of weather developing, and this is called the Little Ice Age. And that starts in the Arctic in around 1200, and it starts to spread south. It first affects Greenland and then Iceland and the Norse settlers that were there. And then Northern Europe is starting to be affected by this Little Ice Age by the early 1300s. It wasn't that the weather just got colder by several degrees, but rather it got extremely unpredictable and wetter. And so how do we know that this Little Ice Age actually occurred? We've got a number of sources that information comes from. We can find evidence to prove and kind of track these dramatic weather changes through looking at statistics to do with grain prices, how they fluctuated. There's chronicle accounts, so like our Anglo-Saxon Chronicle or our chroniclers in Ireland, they're keeping accounts. They're talking about this is the coldest winter we've ever seen. We've got governmental records that talk about it. We have decrees and letters that discuss these things. But scientifically speaking, we also have things like pollen analysis that can be done in peat bogs, lake sediments, tree rings that show these sort of things. Scientists have also taken Arctic ice core samples that show that during this time period, there was a dramatic shift in the weather. So we know it happened. And there's a couple of possible causes that scientists and historical people have put forward for this. We know that there were a few volcanoes that had erupted around the world in the 1200s. So that could have contributed to sentiment in the atmosphere, causing less sunshine to get through. The salt content in the ocean water changed, and this salt content change causes a shift in overall water temperatures, which then affects water currents and wind patterns over the ocean. So like trade winds kind of shifting around. And all of that over the ocean can gradually start to affect the weather over the continent, and especially over the islands of Ireland and Britain. And because we know that there had just been the medieval warm period, and that had been some of the warmest 4 centuries in a millennium. Uh, Seeing the difference between that time period and what came after is pretty obvious. And so it kind of looks like this was maybe a normal readjustment to colder temperatures that we'd seen before. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what kind of what Europe went through when they were experiencing this, and then kind of the after effects of that. So starting in around 1314, European weather started an unpredictable tailspin that lasted over 2 decades before leveling off at a lower average temperature. In 1314, it began raining during the normal fall harvest time when it should have normally been sunny and dry. This affected the ability to harvest the wheat crop and to store it and to dry it for the winter. In 1315 and 1316, these years were even worse for the harvest. It was reported that it rained for nearly 100 days straight in some places. Seeded fields had been washed away, low-lying areas were flooded, rivers were overflowing their banks and threatening nearby villages. Um, for example, we have a record that 450 small villages were washed away in northern Germany alone. After the rains, this 100-day reign stopped. They were followed by extreme cold winters that were coupled with really terrible storms and coastal flooding. We have records of rivers freezing, bays freezing, and coastal areas being trapped. We have ships that have apparently been trapped in the ice when they normally have been able to go in and out of harbors. So there's a lot of evidence of kind of a chaotic, unpredictable weather pattern that's going on at this time. And as a result of this, people are unable to plant or harvest, and this caused widespread famine throughout Europe. And so this time period is called the Great Famine, and it lasted until the mid 1320s, and it really decimated the population. Those who survived were left weaker and more susceptible to disease. On average, it seems that about 5 to 10% of the European population died during the years of the Great Famine. This cut across all social levels, not simply the peasants, but nobles were affected, churchmen, and especially the people who are living in towns. As I've discussed previously, towns and cities are booming in Western Europe once again, and these cities relied heavily on harvest collected by the nearby peasants and serfs and farmers that worked in the countryside near those cities. And without them there to sell their goods at markets, where are those townspeople getting their food from? Animal herds also suffered. Not only are they starving because of a lack of hay and fodder, but many of these herds were actually struck with an animal disease, a murrain, and it killed large portions of herds across Europe. Smaller herds meant that meat and animal food products were less available as well. And this mass scarcity of normal food products resulted in reports of people eating things normally considered taboo, like dogs and cats and rats and horses, and even rumors of cannibalism across Europe as well. Efforts were made by kings and nobles to limit the effects of the famine, but mostly were ineffective. Some people had been holding onto grain stores in the hopes of capitalizing on the high demand. So to counteract this hoarding of grain, we see King Edward II of England. He issued proclamations setting prices for food at previous levels before the mini ice age and the Great Famine hit. King Louis of France made similar proclamations. There was no social safety network, though, to provide food for everyone affected. The centralized governments were simply not equipped to deal with such large-scale tragedy. There were grain riots in Germany, in France, and Belgium, resulting in violence and burning of bakeries. The Italian cities of Florence and Siena seemed to be able to keep a cap on their violent riots by imposing fixed prices and giving out measured amounts of grain that they had managed to import from North Africa. So we see trade kind of playing a role in this as well. By the mid 1320s, the weather seemed to have evened out and resumed its normal seasonal pattern. However, the temperature was now a couple of degrees lower than it had been during that medieval warm period. And this lower temperature resulted in the harvest seasons being shorter by 2 to 3 weeks. After the Great Famine had passed, the kings and nobles of Europe were able to resume their favorite pastime, which is political infighting, and war. So we will move on to that. In 1328, Charles IX, the King of France, died, and he left no heirs. Charles had a sister, Isabella, who did have a male heir, a 13-year-old named Edward. He also just so happened to be Edward III, King of England. But his inheritance to the French throne was through the female line, through his mother. And that inheritance through the female line was not considered valid by French nobles. So instead of selecting the king's nephew, they turned to Philip of Valois, who was a cousin to Charles and an adult and definitely a Frenchman. He became Charles IV of Valois when these Frenchmen decided to crown him as the new King of France. Edward III, the King of England, did not push his claim at that time. He was very young and he was new to his own throne. However, as time passed, economic and political tensions between England and France grew increasingly hostile. And part of this hostility was due to the fact that the King of England still held some lands in France as a fief from the French throne. This is the last vestiges of the Eleanor of Aquitaine's inheritance when she married Henry II, the King of England, back in 1152. So remember when we were talking about King John and how he ended up, through inept maneuverings and poor decisions on the military field, how he essentially lost the majority of his inheritance on the continent. If you look at the map here, down here, the area that England still had in continental France is this coastline here called Gascony, essentially. And so it's this coastline here that we're talking about. So about 10 years after the death of Charles IX and the skipping over of Edward III as a viable claimant to the French throne, the new French king, Philip of Valois, invaded those English lands of Gascony in 1337, essentially declaring war. And now this action started what was going to become known as the 100 Years' War. We can look at the 100 Years' War as having 5 distinct phases, punctuated by peace, tension, and proxy wars. And it's easier to kind of break it down by these 5 periods than to look at it all as a whole. So we are going to now discuss the first phase. So the first phase is the beginning. It's 1337 to 1360. And this is the beginning of the war, and it is dominated by English victories. Our first victory is the Battle of Sulls, which is a naval battle, and that happened on June 24th, 1340. It's really our first real conflict of the 100 Years' War. The French had allied with Spanish Castilians, so different areas of Spain. And even with the powerful Spanish galleys, the English were able to defeat the French and their Spanish allies, even though they were using smaller and more inferior ships. If you look over at the map here, or the PowerPoint here, I've got this picture here, and this is a painting of the Battle of Sulls. And it's often been described as almost a land battle because the ships were so close together. You had soldiers just fighting across their bows. So it was a really intense naval battle. Our second biggest time period at this point is in 1346. And this is when the English launch a 2-prong attack on the actual mainland of France. So it's not a sea battle, it's a land battle now. And so the English landmen in the areas of Aquitaine and then in Normandy. And these smaller armies essentially attack cities, villages. They do anything that they can to disrupt the normal functioning of the French state, especially tax collecting. Because if they hit them in the tax collecting, that's really where it hurts the most. If they don't have that tax money, they're not able to fund their treasury, and they're not able to pay for the services that they need, and the food and the men and the armor to fight back against the English. So this 2-prong attack launched in 1346 is pretty effective. And then what happens with this 2-prong attack is you have eventually the French are able to get an army out into the field. And on August 26th, 1346, we have our first large land battle, and this is the Battle of Crécy. The English in this battle are hugely outnumbered. Remember, they were part of this two-prong attack on the continent, and so they weren't really a full army. They were more of just scouting, attacking groups. And so the English are hugely outnumbered in this Battle of Crécy, and they're facing a very large but very unorganized French cavalry and foot soldiers. And due to French confusion and the geography of the battlefield, the English were able to be victorious. They lost only about 100 or so men, whereas they killed nearly 12,000 Frenchmen, and they ended up capturing another 1,500. And what was really important about Crécy is just the landscape of the battlefield. The English were able to take advantage of the fact that they were on a hillside that was surrounded by forests on either side. So again, they were able to minimize the large numbers of the French army because there was only a narrow space to fight in. And so even though they were outnumbered, they were able to be victorious because of the landscape and the geography of the battlefield. Our next big battle comes about 10 years later, and this is the Battle of Portois. And this happens in September of 1356. And the English at this point are under the command of Edward III's oldest son, and he's known as Edward the Black Prince of Wales. He's known as the Black Prince of Wales because he has this beautiful black and gold inlaid gold armor, and so that's kind of where that name comes from. And Edward the Black Prince of Wales was able to lead the English into a very important victory at this Battle of Portois, and they actually managed to capture the French king, John II, and his son on the field. So they captured the king and his heir, which is really important. And so with the French king and his heir held as hostages, the English were able to force the French into a truce. And this truce becomes the Peace of Brittany, and that was signed in October of 1360. And this agreement included a huge ransom for the French king. And then it recognized English control over the territories that they had captured in France during that two-pronged attack. And Edward agreed to give up his claim to the French throne as a result of this Peace of Brittany. So the English are able to get lands in France as long as Edward III was willing to give up his claim to the throne, which he was willing to do. So that's the end of our first phase of the 100 Years' War, and we see the English being extremely victorious in this first phase. And some of the reasons why they were able to be so victorious, even when they were outnumbered and fighting in somebody else's territory, is that the English employed a number of different military technologies and tactics that helped them in their victories. And some of those included just smart thinking when it came to battlefield choices. The English had the battlefield advantage in both the Battle of Crécy and in Portois. They chose the high ground. There were weather contributions to this, the geography of the land playing a role. At the Battle of Portois, it had been raining for days before the battle had happened, and the English had set up on a hillside right in front of like a field, essentially like a grain field. And so not only do you have a tilled field that is being aerated by peasants, but then it's being churned up by the rain. So it's a really muddy field. And so the French are coming in with their cavalry into a hugely muddy field, and the horses are getting stuck in the mud. They're getting bogged down, and they're not able to attack the English as fast as they normally would. And so this battlefield really contributes to that. Another thing that the English are able to take into battle and be very victorious with is it's not really a new invention, but it's something that the English employ more than anybody else in Europe. And this is the use of the longbow. The longbow fires at 3 times the rate of a crossbow, and it's far more accurate, and it actually has a longer range. The crossbow is something that is employed by mercenaries in a lot of armies, but this English longbow is something that the English train in, they practice in, and they're very effective with it. And they're able, as I said, to shoot arrows at 3 times the rate of a crossbow. And so this gives them quite an advantage as well. And then we also have the English are using a long pike to sort of stop the cavalry charges of the French. Now, this is very similar to what Alexander the Great's father did, Philip, when he was innovating his armies back when he was trying to consolidate power within Greece before Alexander the Great, conquered the Persian Empire. So if you see here on the screen, I have these long pikes, and obviously they're long enough where you would stop a horse coming at you, as long as you're dug into the ground behind that to sort of back you. But we have the pikes that are usually put up in defense of the archers. So the archers are behind a line of pikes, so they're defended a bit. So they're able to continuously shoot these arrows at the bogged down cavalry that's stuck in the mud, essentially. And we also see the English employing the use of dismounted soldiers that are trained to fight on the ground, not just when they lose their horses. And so we have foot soldiers that are really being effectively trained to fight hand to hand on the battlefield. And then another thing that the English do, and this isn't really new, but it's something that they employ very effectively against the French. And this has to do with that two-prong attack that they launched initially in France. And it's these countryside raidings, and they're called chevauchés. And so these groups of knights and soldiers will kind of essentially attack the countryside and just slash and burn. They attack villages, they attack fields, they disrupt the governance of the lands, and they undermine the ruler by showing that that ruler can't protect the people in the countryside. So even though they're the ones doing the attacking, they're also showing that the French can't help their peasants either. So it's undermining the rule of the French. So our second phase is from 1364 to 1380. And this is when English victories are minimized by French victories and proxy wars in Brittany and in Castile. And with these proxy wars, it's kind of like a Cold War, essentially. England and France are fighting, but they're fighting through other people. Both England and France backed a different candidate for the position of the Duke of Brittany because there wasn't a clear heir. They both offered a different groom for the young female heir to the Count of Flanders. So again, trying to control those two very powerful land areas. And then both militarily backed a different candidate to the Castilian throne as well. So they're putting up rival candidates for various things, and overwhelmingly the French are usually winning out with these ones. And so that's why this time period is characterized by French victories, even though they're not battlefield victories. Our third phase is from 1380 to 1413. And this is where there's internal political turmoil in both of the kingdoms. And it kind of starts off with this war over the Castilian throne is happening in Spain. And the English actually send the Black Prince of Wales, so Edward III's heir. He goes to Castile, which, like I said before, is in Spain. And he goes there and he's fighting, but he actually falls ill. And he never fully recovers. We still don't know today what he had. It was some sort of a wasting illness, but it took a really long time for him to die. It was several years that he was in pretty poor health. But he dies a year before his father, Edward III, dies. And so Edward, the Black Prince of Wales' 10-year-old son, because he's the eldest son of the eldest son, inherits the throne. So when Edward III dies, he's followed by a 10-year-old boy named Richard. So this guy becomes King Richard II. And normally this would be something that the French could capitalize on. But the French king had also recently died, leaving another young man as king as well. And so both of these kingdoms are kind of focused on their own internal turmoil that's happening. We've got peasant revolts that are happening, and various family struggles, because obviously a minor can't rule on their own. So who's going to be the regent? Who's going to have that power? Richard II, the King of England, is a terrible king. And he's actually overthrown by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, in 1399. And so we have a new line of people on the throne of England, and that is the Lancastrian family. And then the French nobles are involved in a civil war over power because their young king has proven to be actually legitimately crazy. And so we've got different cousins that are fighting for power in France as well. So this time period up until about 1413 is really, there's no fighting between France and England directly. They're just dealing with their own internal issues. But our fourth phase is from 1413 to 1429. And this is where English victories hit their highest point. And this is under the reign of Henry V. And our first real big victory under Henry V is this Battle of Agincourt. And that happens in October of 1415. And once again, at this battle, the English force is hugely outnumbered, but they are located on higher ground. Again, above a recently plowed field, which is again mostly muddy because it's been raining. The French cavalry is weighed down with heavy armor. They're slowed down by this muddy field. And this allows those English longbowmen to send wave after wave of piercing arrows down onto these French forces. It's estimated that about 10,000 Frenchmen were killed, including many nobles and knights. Truly, the flower of French chivalry was killed in this 4-hour battle. The English supposedly lost only 300 men. So it's a huge battle for it's a huge victory for the English, even considering they were greatly outnumbered. So this battle leads to the Treaty of Troyes. And this Treaty of Troyes was signed by Henry V and King Charles VI. King Charles VI. Now remember, I already said that the French king was crazy, and this is the French king that's crazy. It's King Charles VI, and he's considered incoherent. He doesn't understand things. It seems like it could have possibly have been early onset dementia, but we don't know. It's hard to diagnose mental and physical ailments of the past. But we believe that King Charles's wife actually probably signed this treaty for him. And so what this treaty declared is that the French king would continue to rule while he was alive. But upon his death, Henry V would succeed to the French throne. So we would now have an English king inheriting the French throne. So this is a huge deal. And to seal this deal, Henry V marries the daughter of Charles VI. So he marries a French princess named Catherine of Valois to kind of seal this. So we'll still have Catherine's children will inherit the French throne. So we do still have a French blood on the throne at least. And so the enforcement of this treaty was complicated, though. It could have been a great victory, could have ended the 100 Years' War. But Henry V dies a year later, and Charles VI dies a year later. And so all we have is the 9-month-old son of Henry V to inherit. And so Henry VI, a 9-month-old child, inherits the throne of England and France, technically, according to the Treaty of Troyes, or of Troyes, excuse me. So this is just, again, it's a very complicated situation. So our fifth portion of the 100 Years' War goes from 1429 to 1453. And this is where the French gradually win the war, or rather, where the English gradually lose the war. So our young king, Henry VI, is obviously not playing much of a role in politics or the ruling of his two countries. And so the responsibility of ruling England and France falls to his uncles and older cousins. And so these men rule quite efficiently and effectively for some time, but as it does, power tends to corrupt, and royal uncles are no exception to this rule. The eldest uncle is the Duke of Bedford, and he had a very similar military tactical genius that his brother Henry V had had. And so the Duke of Bedford is in charge of ruling the English lands in France. And which he did really well for the most part, because the French, again, are heavily divided. They're still dealing with a civil war, and they're unable to mount kind of a unified front against the English. However, they are able to unite when they have someone to unite behind. And this happens when an illiterate teenage girl from a small village in France starts to hear voices of angels telling her that she has to save the French from these English invaders. And this is Joan of Arc. So Joan of Arc goes to the court of the French prince, who was disinherited when his father signed the Treaty of Troyes, saying that Henry V would inherit the throne. So we have this disinherited French prince who's called the Dauphin. That's what they call their, England has their Prince of Wales, French has the Dauphin. And so Joan of Arc goes to the Dauphin's court and convinces him to give her an army to drive the English out. And he does. He just gives her an army. It's kind of, what do we have to lose, essentially? Except for the lives of peasants that are fighting in the field. What else do we have to lose? So Joan leads a French force, and she breaks the English siege of the city of Orleans in 1429. She then proceeds to break the English hold on a number of other key locations in the northern part of France. And so To contend with this new resistance, the Duke of Bedford moves troops from other areas of Normandy and France to start fighting against Joan. But this, of course, leaves those areas weakened, and they have less soldiers in them to kind of hold those areas. So Joan rode with the French prince. She actually saw him crowned as Charles VII, King of France. And she actually crowned him herself. She held the crown and put it on his head. But the thanks she received for her role in uniting the French and rallying the cause was betrayal. Joan was captured in May of 1430 by the English, who in turn offered to ransom her back to the French, but the French refused to pay her ransom. So the English instead decide to try Joan as a heretic and as a witch. And they do this to undermine her role in helping the French cause. She crowned the French king, and if the English can convict her of being a witch and a heretic, well, what does that say about the person she just crowned? So it's kind of this political infighting that's going on. So we have a lot of churchmen that start interviewing Joan. They question her relationship and her communication with God through those saints, through those visions that she heard. Are these voices divine, or could they be demonic? The clergy claim that by wearing men's clothing, Joan was rejecting her God-given nature as a woman. She claims the voices told her to dress this way for safety and practicability. The clerics asked her very in-depth questions about her faith, hoping to trick her up. Considering she was an illiterate girl from a small village, she held up really well to those powerful, learned scholars. She was able to answer them in very learned ways. So after days of interrogation, Joan finally agrees to start wearing women's clothing again. That seemed to be the thing that they were really hung up on. However, she's still in prison with other prisoners. So the next day, she goes back to wearing men's clothing again because it's safer in that prison setting for her to do that. But because she went back on her word to wear women's clothing, that's where these English clerics are able to convict her. And so they are able to convict her of going back on her word. And she's burned at the stake on May 30th of 1431. She's only 19 years old, but she had managed to break the English military hold on northern France and unite the French behind their king. So she did a lot in her very small time. And so after this, the English knew only defeat in France because the French had been rallied together and were united. We no longer have the civil war happening. We now have another king, King Charles VII of France, that they are able to rally behind. So in 1436, the English lose Paris, which had been given to them as part of the Treaty of Troyes. And in 1438, King Charles VII launched an invasion of the English lands in the south, in Gascony, those areas that they held from Eleanor of Aquitaine's inheritance. The English tried to fight back, but because of their own internal fighting, they proved unable to hold their ground. The inept rule of the English king certainly did not help matters. Henry VI eventually grows up. He's no longer a child, and he starts asserting himself at court and doing so incredibly badly. The official end to the 100 Years' War was marked by an English defeat of no real importance in 1453. It was just a small skirmish between maybe 20 to 30 men on either side. It was really nothing. But when Henry VI heard the news of this defeat, and one of his favorites had actually been in that battle and was killed, Henry VI falls into a catatonic coma-like state that lasted for 18 months. And so after this, the English are really not interested in fighting in France anymore. They had far larger problems to deal with at home. And these problems that are a result of kind of his catatonic state, and also it results from Henry Bolingbroke taking the throne from his cousin Richard II. All of this leads to the English War of Roses, which we will not be able to discuss today, unfortunately. But England is embroiled in a lot of internal turmoil and infighting for the throne after this. And so they just don't have the time, the manpower, or really the money to continue fighting against France. And so that's why the end of the war is so anticlimactic, because they just stop fighting and that's how it ends. So with all of this war going on, it's hard to imagine that anything else was going on, but there was a great many things occurring at the exact same time in Europe, including one of the most devastating plagues that has ever affected humanity, even considering we're in the age of the COVID currently. So we're going to be backtracking a little bit in time here, but it's easier to kind of look thematically at some of these events and as opposed to looking at them chronologically. So stick with me here. So the Black Death Plague, this plague can almost certainly be traced back to Central Asia in the 1330s. Some believe that the particular pandemic that decimated Europe was caused by settlers in Central Asia interacting with rodent populations. Even today, in the United States, in the southwest of the United States, there are prairie dog populations that carry the Black Death disease, and they actually transfer it to people a few times a year. And so when these new settlers moved into these areas of Central Asia that they had not lived in before, and they come into contact with these rodent populations, the disease within the rodents transfers to the humans. It's kind of similar to what we're dealing with today, possibly, no one really knows. But that's how the Black Death Plague got started. At least that's what historians and scientists believe. There's other theories out there that the disease, the Black Death Plague, is actually an outbreak of anthrax, or there's questions about who the carrier of the disease actually was. But I'm going to give you the most commonly accepted understanding of the Black Death Plague, which is that it was caused by the Yersinia pestis bacillus, which was spread by fleas on infected black rats. So the black rats and their fleas were not black rats and fleas themselves were not directly affected by the Black Death Plague the way that humans were. There was sort of a symbiotic relationship between the disease and their carriers. Obviously, if the disease killed rats, they wouldn't live long enough to spread that to humans. And so we know that the disease lives in cohesion with its carriers. And so those fleas would bite the infected rats, and then the fleas would infect humans through biting them. And the disease would be carried through their saliva, passed through a bite, or even through the feces of an infected flea. Can come into contact with a human sore, or it can be breathed into the lungs. So there's a number of ways that a human can contract the Black Death Plague from these infected fleas. The rat flea can survive up to 80 days away from its carrier. So it can survive up to 80 days away from a rat. And that is long enough to travel in a merchant goods or on a trading ship or in clothing or in grain. And so this disease is really well equipped to spread and to survive. So the plague spreads out, affecting China and India and traveling west through the overland trade routes into Persia and to the Middle East. And you can kind of see from the maps here how it progressed, kind of goes along that Silk trade route. And then you can see sort of the waves of it going across Europe as it spreads. So by 1345, the Black Death Plague had reached the Black Sea. So it had reached this area right here. There was this famous siege at Kaffa, and Kaffa is right up here. It's actually in Crimea, where we've heard a lot of political stuff about in recent years. So there is this siege at Kaffa, and the people who are being besieged are these Italian merchants, and they're being besieged by the Mongol army. And this is in 1345. The Mongol army is besieging the city of Kaffa, and they fall victim to the Black Death Plague. And so before they retreat, because obviously they're dying, they share the plague with the people inside the wall by catapulting dead bodies infected with the plague over the walls. So that's how they spread it. And so the Italian merchant ships, the Genoese, they leave Kaffa and they travel to Constantinople after the siege has been lifted, and they spread the plague to the enormous city of Constantinople in 1347. So again, the disease can last in traded goods for months, and so it's able to spread quite quickly. And so after it spreads to Constantinople, because Constantinople is such a hub of travel, it easily spreads from there into Europe, especially into Italy first. So June 1348, the plague had managed to travel as far north as Bavaria and Paris. And from Gascony, The plague sailed to England in the summer of 1348 and had reached Ireland and Scotland by the following spring. So the plague continues to spread north into the Baltic states and the northernmost Russia until 1353 when it seemingly dissipated. So that's kind of the spread and how it progressed. And now I'm going to talk a little bit more directly about the plague itself. So there's three forms of Black Death plague that we're aware of. The first form is the most common form, and that is the bubonic. And symptoms of the bubonic plague include buboes, which are these painful swellings that happen near your lymph nodes, in your armpit, the groin, the neck. And these buboes symptoms are accompanied by severe flu-like symptoms. Death occurs in 50 to 80% of cases and generally will happen within 3 to 6 days of showing symptoms. If a person survives past a week with these symptoms, they would usually survive permanently. So the next form is the pneumonic plague. And this form of the disease is spread by droplets of blood coughed into the air by an infected person and then inhaled into the lungs of another person. Or it's caused by inhaling the infected flea feces. Initial symptoms are flu-like, and then there's a lot of coughing and difficulty breathing. And within 3 days of the onset of symptoms, death occurs. The pneumonic plague is generally 100% fatal. And now there is a third variation of the plague, and this is where when the plague virus or that bacteria becomes so concentrated in the human bloodstream that human lice and flea and other bugs can transfer it from person to person. So like a mosquito could transfer it. This form is extremely rare, and it doesn't seem to have played too much of a role in the rapid spread of the disease, but it could kill within hours of symptoms occurring. And this was 100% fatal as well. But the most common was the bubonic form of this plague, and that's why it's been known as the bubonic plague. And from the images here, you can see this first image here. This is actually a picture of a person who had the bubonic plague in the early 1900s. There was an outbreak in India. And so you can see this is what the buboes sort of looked like. And then you've got some medieval imagery of people with the buboes as well. And then kind of this idea that, you know, it's spread by rats. That was the association that people had. One important thing to remember about the plague is that, and much like in the days of the COVID, people knew it was coming. News of the plague traveled faster than the plague itself did. And all people could do was wait for it to arrive. The psychological impact of this is immeasurable, although we probably could make some estimates based on our own experiences now. But people did practice a few types of early quarantine-like measures, but due to a lack of knowledge of germ theory and how the plague was being transferred, these measures were largely useless. So we see bonfires being lit near their gates of cities, or the burning of incense in the entrances of homes to sort of ward off that bad air. People held sweet-smelling flowers to their noses to prevent inhaling the bad air. Sometimes the homes of the infected were simply locked and barred from the outside, allowing no one in and no one out. So a very forced quarantine, and you have to wonder if they made sure that those people had food and water when they were being locked inside. Ships were not allowed to dock in harbors if it was known that they had sailed from an area that had had the plague. So they did some sort of quarantine measures. There was no wearing of masks, though. So we do have some evidence of how people dealt with this, and one of your primary sources, actually two of your primary sources, deal with firsthand accounts of people experiencing the plague. So I definitely want you to read those two accounts to kind of get kind of that firsthand experience of someone who went through it and wrote down their account. But we have there was a lot of theories and ideas about what caused the plague. And one of our other primary sources is actually a document written by the University of Paris medical faculty. So all of mankind was at a loss to explain where this plague had come from or how to treat it. Doctors were completely baffled by the disease and were unable to come up with any successful remedies for it, although they tried. After the plague had eventually passed, many physicians were accused of fleeing their responsibilities and refusing to treat patients, much like how the clergy was also accused of doing the same thing. But we know that doctors died in higher numbers than the average population, so obviously they were still sticking around and treating people. But the most famous medical theory on the causes of the plague was written by the Paris Consortium, and that is this University of Paris medical faculty. And it was written by 49 physicians at the University of Paris, and it was published in October of 1348, so right in the thick of the outbreak. And it was written at the request of the King of France. And this document states that the ultimate cause of the plague would never be known. It's a safe way of saying that, that only God knows. However, they did say that there was a celestial cause, that the conjunctions of the planets of Saturn and Jupiter and Mars under the wet constellation of Aquarius, following both a solar and a lunar eclipse, was the cause of this plague. And there was this solar eclipse that they talk about happened in 1348. And it was a really big deal. People didn't have explanations for it. They didn't know it was coming. And so suddenly the sun is blotted out. And there's a lot of fears about that sort of thing. So this document is pretty interesting. So I hope you guys enjoy it when you're reading it. There is a couple of other theories that I'm going to talk about as well. So one of them is the miasma theory. And it was believed that the air itself was poisoned from toxins that were being released because of earthquakes and erupting volcanoes and even rotten smelling swamps. And that those planets of Saturn and Jupiter and Mars were drawing those bad vapors out of the earth, and that was what was causing the disease. People also blamed the Jews. Remember in our Crusades how we had the People's Crusade that attacked villages that had large Jewish populations? Well, Jews were also blamed in high numbers for the Black Death Plague as well. For the most part, Jewish communities seem to fare slightly better than their Christian neighbors. And this is partly because of the fact that Jewish ghettos were already partially quarantined. Interaction between Christians and Jews in medieval cities was limited, and they tended to trade within their own community, resulting in limited contact with infected people and trade goods that could have been carrying the plague. Jews also had cleaner hygiene practices than their Christian neighbors, but because of all of these things, the Jews were not as affected by the Black Death Plague as their Christians were. And so because of this, many Christians claimed that the Jews were the cause of the Black Death Plague. And their most common accusation was that the Jews were poisoning wells. And these accusations resulted in violent, murderous attacks on Jewish communities. So we had another wave of pogroms happening during this Black Death Plague time against Jews. And after the plague subsided, these attacks died off, but Jewish communities suffered a great deal from these attacks during the outbreak. There's also a concern that general sinfulness of the European population had brought this plague down. They brought this plague down on themselves for being sinful, much like they had with Noah's flood in the Bible, or maybe they were just making too much noise, and the Mesopotamian gods wanted to punish them for that. But they believed that the plague was maybe God's way of purifying a sinful world. The Pope led a number of religious processions and fasts and prayers, and he encouraged all of his bishops to do the same. We do have a religious movement that develops out of this, and this is called the Flagellant movement. And it comes out of a religious desire to purge oneself of sinfulness through self-inflicted physical pain. So while the plague was still raging, there's groups of men marching through towns and countrysides, and they would proceed to whip themselves as the town population watched. This is a really weird movement, but it allowed a sort of collective grief and guilt to sort of be worked off by the flagellants and the onlookers. And you can see images of the flagellants down here at the bottom of the PowerPoint slide. And actually over here on the right is was the medieval chart that the Paris medical faculty created to explain the conjunction of those planets and why it was causing the Black Death plague. It's very interesting stuff. Um, so the initial outbreak of the plague in 1347 lasted for a few years. So it lasted for about 6 years because it sort of dissipated around 1353. And during that time, it killed around, and again, these are really rough estimates, but it killed around 30 million people. And this is at least 40 to 50% of Europe's population. And sadly, the initial outbreak was followed by several other outbreaks that continued to plague societies for centuries. The last outbreak of the Black Death Plague in England was recorded in 1666. So that's 3 centuries of outbreaks. The immediate post Black Death world was one that, on the surface, minus the deaths of 40% of the population, was not that much different politically and socially speaking, which is another reason why the Hundred Years' War continued to happen right as the Black Death Plague was going through. However, European society was forever altered as a result of this Black Death Plague. It might not have shown immediately, but society was very different. People started to question their roles in society, and the authorities who had benefited from the hierarchy system started to be questioned as well. That whole the three orders. Why does a peasant have to be a peasant? That sort of thing. The church suffered a great deal during and after the Black Death Plague, and it suffered a loss of confidence, which was almost the most important thing. Uh, in addition to the fact that many priests, bishops, monks, nuns had died, and the church was struggling to replace all of these parish priests with qualified spiritual men. Instead, many parishes were given to priests who couldn't read Latin. They didn't know how to give mass in Latin. These new priests were not living lives reflective of their holy titles. Um, on top of these inadequate priests, the church was dealing with larger problems, which we're going to talk about now. Um, as previously discussed, the papacy and the European kings struggled for centuries to assert dominance over one another. In 1306, obviously this is before the Black Death Plague, in 1306, the French king, Philip IV, had convinced the newly elected French pope, or he wasn't a French pope, he was a pope who was elected by the College of Cardinals, but he happened to be from of French descent. I should clarify that. But the French king convinced this pope of French descent to approve the expulsion of all Jews from France. Philip King Philip had a lot of outstanding debt to Jewish moneylenders, and this expulsion was his way of avoiding having to pay for it. But the fact that he was able to force the Pope to do that really says a lot about the power dynamic they had there. And then in 1307, the Pope allowed Philip to launch a surprise attack on all the Templars. So remember our military orders from the Crusades? The Order of the Templars, because of that banking system they set up and all of the donations of lands they were given in Europe, the Templars were able to build up a lot of power and become really wealthy landowners within Europe itself. And Philip wanted to seize all of that property and money that the Templars had. So in 1307, he convinced the Pope to allow him to launch a attack against these Templars in France. And he seized all of their property, money, and goods. And this occurred on a Friday that was also the 13th of the month. And this is actually where the idea of Friday the 13th being unlucky comes from, is this attack against the Jews. And then 2 years later, in 1309, Philip convinces the Pope to, move away from Rome, come back to France, set up shop in the city of Avignon, and why don't you just rule the church, Christendom, from the areas of France? And the Pope goes ahead with this. So the Pope moves from Rome, where the popes had been for a millennia, all the way to the northern part of Europe, to France, to the city of Avignon. And this move has been called the Babylonian captivity. Remember, our Babylonian captivity is actually when the Jews of Jerusalem were captured and brought back to Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar during, what was it, 700s BC, sometime like that. So this is a new Babylonian captivity. where the Pope is sort of being held captive in France by the French king. So while the Pope is in France, the king used him as a religious tool that he wielded against the English during the Hundred Years' War, and he also forced that Pope to favor French religious policies as well. Um, Many years later, in 1377, a new pope who had been elected decided to move the papacy back to Rome. However, this pope died shortly after he had changed and moved from Avignon to Rome. And this led to the French cardinals electing a pope and then the Roman cardinals electing another pope. So we have two rival popes that were elected in 1377. One's French and one is Roman, kind of Italian. And this rivalry, this situation has become known as the Great Western Schism. So we had the schism between Western Christendom and the Greek Orthodox within the Byzantine Empire. And now this one is called the Great Western Schism because it's a schism, a break within the Western Church, within Western Europe. So this multiple rival pope situation continued for many years and contributed to the decline of the church's authority over secular powers. But it also forced the church to adapt new policies that in the end would be working for them for the better. And what part of this movement was called the conciliar movement or conciliarism. Sorry, my pronunciation isn't always the best. It's down here, conciliarism. And this is where the church started advocating that the church councils were powerful and that church councils could make decisions on important spiritual matters over that of the Pope. And so it kind of was turning, we have this problem with two popes. So instead, we're just going to give power to church councils and kind of ignore the multiple pope situation. So this conciliar movement was a direct result of this Great Western Schism. And it gave a lot of power and authority behind these church councils. However, it did remain in the Pope's power to call together these councils, which they would rarely do because, of course, the papacy wants to maintain its own power under the Pope and not these church councils. But again, adjustments are always being made. But this whole Western Schism is definitely a result of that Babylonian captivity of the papacy by the French. Other fallouts from the Black Death Plague included a change in the supply and demand of peasant labor. The death of 50% of the population created an agricultural labor shortage, a huge shortage. But it also allowed those surviving peasants to move from farming those bad, unproductive lands that they had that they were forced to farm, during that medieval warm period because you had more people to feed. And so the peasants were able to kind of start farming the good lands instead of those bad lands too. And so this did cause a problem though, because the lords of those lands still wanted to see their workers working those lands. They didn't want their workers to leave their fields and go to greener fields or greener pastures, if you will. So to entice people, their peasants, to stay on their lands, these landlords started to offer lower feudal obligations. Remember some of those feudal obligations where you had to pay a death tax, you had to get permission to get married, you had to work on the Lord's personal demesne, 3 days out of the week, things like that. So these landlords were starting to offer lower feudal obligations that were normally a part of that rental agreement. Landlords also offered higher wages for skilled day laborers. So what they were paying people who weren't their peasants to work, they increased. And they lowered rents for cottages and for farmland as well. And so this situation created an open market competition over labor that gave peasants agency and value for the first time. And this really allowed those peasants to recognize how important and vital they were to the working order of medieval Europe. However, after a few years had passed, the landlords and the monarchies began to try to tip the scales back in their favor again and away from acknowledging the value of those peasants. And we see this happen first in England. In 1351, there is a statute of laborers that is passed by Parliament. Remember, Parliament was founded with the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215 by King John. So the statute of laborers said that It was meant to prevent peasants and laborers from demanding lower rents and feudal obligations and demanding higher wages. And it was meant to also stop landlords from luring peasants and serfs away from the manors that they were born onto and enticing them to come to their own lands with these lower offers. So it was not only the laborers, but the landowners that were being held accountable for breaking these statutes. So it was trying to kind of prevent the problem and then prevent the luring as well. And we also see things across Europe like price and wage regulations. We see statutes being sent out that set fixed wages for specific amounts of work, an agreement to those rates and conditions. This is happening in Italy, in Spain, and France as well. The punishment for demanding wages higher than this set rate could be working all day without pay, to corporal punishment, to even execution, depending on where you're located. And so some of these areas are really trying to crack down on peasants being able to assert their agency. And then to add to this, we also have a number of sumptuary laws that are getting passed. And there's sumptuary laws in England that were passed in 1363. And these laws, these sumptuary laws, dictate what members of each order or station in life were allowed and expected to wear. It was as much about peasants dressing above their order as it was about knights and gentry dressing below what was fitting for their ranks in society. So this shows that there was a concern over social hierarchy and an inversion of the world. Remember what happened to Joan of Arc when she was wearing men's clothes, something she shouldn't have been doing. They used that to execute her. And so these sumptuary laws are dictating the types of clothing and colors of clothing and furs and things that people of different stations are able to wear. And so the monarchy and the political organizations are trying to maintain a visual control over people as much as they're trying to maintain them on their lands as well. So on top of these new laws that were meant to keep peasants in their traditional place, the governments are still taxing those peasants at pre-plague levels. So they're expecting those peasants to still come up with the same amount of tax money as they would have when their village had 50% more people in it. And so it's madness. And remember, the 100 Years' War is still being fought during this time period as well. And those armies and those monarchies need that tax money to fund their wars. So this increased taxation in France that followed the defeat of the French at the Battle of Portois and the capture of King John. Remember, there was that large ransom that the French had to raise to get King John back. That was part of the Treaty of Brittany. So in 1356, we have an increased amount of taxation that the French are asking from their peasants. And this causes the first in a series of peasant uprisings throughout Europe. The people are demanding more rights. They're demanding participation in the government in some way. They're demanding freedom from serfdom and for the general betterment of their lives. You know, if they're still expected to pay these taxes, the government has to show what they're going to be able to give back to those people. And remember how I mentioned that the English were sending those chevauchés, those raiding bands of knights throughout the countryside to sort of slash and burn these villages? This unrest over taxation is a direct reflection of those attacks. The English are able to undermine the French authority in those areas and show those French people that the French can't defend them, that the monarch can't defend them, and that their tax money is going for nothing. And so we see the first in a series of peasants' revolts. And the one we see in France is called the Jacquerie, and that happens in 1358. And again, it's the success of these English soldiers raiding into France. It's taking its toll. These French peasants are having to mount their own defenses against these English war bands, but they're still being expected to pay their taxes. And so this causes a violent reaction. The peasants attack their landlords and any figure in the government throughout a vast area of the countryside. And now this revolt, this attack on authority figures that is happening by the peasants across the countryside is eventually put down very brutally by the French nobility. And again, this undermines the ability of the French to rule. So the Jacquerie was put down, and it didn't spread too far, but it wasn't the end of peasants' revolts. In 1358, we have a revolt in Florence, in Italy, and it's called the Campi Rebellion. And this is a rebellion amongst the cloth workers in Florence. Cloth and low paid laborers were starting to demand admittance into the city guild systems, and they wanted political representation within the government. And this was, they were demanding these things in response to increased taxation and social tensions. Initially, this Compy rebellion was nonviolent, but eventually the cloth workers took the city by force and created new guilds that allowed nearly every man in Florence to now participate within the government of the city. The Compy, as these groups of rebels became known as, remained in power until 1382. So they remained in power for about 4 years, when they were eventually ousted by the normal oligarchy of elite families that normally ruled Florence. So we've got the Jacquerie, and then we've got the Compy rebellion. But then we have a rebellion in England that happens around the same time. And I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about this one. So this was known as the English Peasants' Revolt. And it started in June of 1381. So again, we're going to kind of go back in our English history a little bit. This is when Edward III's grandson, Richard II, was king. So in 1381, Richard was 14 years old, and his regency council was really mistrusted by the peasantry. They didn't like who was ruling for him. They blamed these evil counselors, that sort of thing. And so this revolt in England, much like the one in France and in Florence, was a direct reaction to increased taxation. Again, this was because of the continued Hundred Years' War. There was a spontaneous attack on tax collectors in Kent, so in southern England, that led to a unified rebellion that attacked abusive landlords, attacked prisons that were holding people in prison for not paying their taxes. Peasants were attacking places that held records, so rental agreements, tax records, that sort of thing. Peasants were attacking any official that was seen to be working for that oppressive government. There were two groups that developed. There was one group in Essex and one group in Kent. And it was made up of a really diverse group of people from various social and economic backgrounds. And these two groups marched to London under the leadership of a man named Wat Tyler and a preacher named John Ball. And so the crown, King Richard and his advisors, were taken completely by surprise, because this rebellion started and managed to get to London in less than 2 weeks. And so the king didn't have armed soldiers at hand in London. Again, the English don't have a standing army, and the soldiers that they do have are in France. So the rebels demanded a meeting with King Richard, but they were initially denied this meeting. And the disappointment of this led to more agitation, and the rebels thought that the king wasn't going to meet with them at all. And so they decided they had to take things into their own hands. And so the rebels were secretly admitted into London through one of the gates of London. No one really knows which. They were allowed into London, where they then maintained a fairly organized attack plan. They didn't just loot everything. They had an organized idea, and they had specific targets that they wanted to hit. And those specific targets were members of the government that were seen as responsible for those increased taxes. So it was John of Gaunt, one of the king's uncles. He was also the chancellor. He was also a government official. And then we have the Chancellor of England, who is the Archbishop of Canterbury, was one of the people they were looking for. The Lord Treasurer, obviously, taxation. And then the Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller. So we've got our Hospitallers, our military order from the Crusades. Again, a very powerful organization within England because of donations of land and money that they were given. And then we also see attacks on foreigners who were involved in the cloth trade. So like Flemish immigrants were attacked. But also lawyers and other government officials were attacked by these rebels in London as well. So in order to draw the rebels out of the city of London, King Richard put out a proclamation that he would agree to meet with them outside of the city. And so when he met with these peasants outside of the city, the rebels demanded pardons for their own participation within this rebellion. They demanded grants or charters granting freedom to all serfs and the clarification of feudal dues owed to a lord by a renter. They wanted reasonable rent rates per acre of farmland, and the death to all traitors. Obviously, you have to add that one at the end. So they're really asking for reasonable clarification on things. So they want to understand exactly what sort of feudal dues that they owe, because different lords demand different things. They want regular taxation rates, they want regular rental rates, just normal things that people expect. Um, and so what Richard does is he's out in the field with all of these rebels and he agrees to grant all of these demands. And he issues a large number of written charters that were given out in hopes that the peasants would just go away. So when Richard met with these peasants, he brought with him a lot of different governmental clerks who were there solely to start writing out pardons and charters as the king was meeting with these rebels. Um, and so once some of these rebels, these peasants were given those charters, they just left. They left London, and they went back home. But as some of these rebels were leaving, the rebellion spreads into some of the northern counties in England as well, and so it spreads beyond London and it starts affecting other parts of the country. And so the king decides that this rebellion has to be put down brutally. And so the the peasants demand another meeting with the king. And at this second meeting, the leader, Wat Tyler, is killed by the mayor of London right in front of the king, and right in front of the rebels. So it's this, this show of force that happens. They capture John Ball, who was the second leader. They try him and he was executed. And later, the king and his ministers are able to capture about 2,000 rebels, and all of those are hung as well. And then throughout the parts of the country where this rebellion has spread, peasants are being tried and fined in their local manor courts by those traveling royal justices as well. And so the next time Parliament met, about a few months after this rebellion was finally put down, they did acknowledge that the revolt was sparked by harsh taxation and errors that had been made by the government. So they admitted that they had something to do with this rebellion. The government repeals some of those taxes that they had been imposing, but a lot of the damage had already been done as a result of this peasants' revolt. And so these rebellions can be seen as a direct reaction to the changes that occurred within society following the Black Death plague. The rising expectations for a better standard of living and a desire for involvement in local and national politics led many of these peasants and laborers to rise up for the first time against a system of government that was centuries old and built itself by holding that 90% of the population to their feudal dues, and their obligations, to serfdom in a field. Uh, so this is in 1381 when this peasants' revolt happened. And so I want you to remember that in 1381, England was still at war with France, and it would be for another 70 or so years. It was only with it was only that the catatonic state that Henry IV went into in 1453 that signaled the true end of the war effort. England was now too focused on internal problems to continue a costly foreign war. And so I realize I've talked about a lot of different themes, that have kind of crossed different chronologies. And so I just want to go over this timeline to really kind of put where we're talking about in your guys' mind. So 1309 is the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. That's when the French king brings the Pope from Rome to Avignon, and that's where the papacy remains until 1377. 1314 to 1320s, that's when our little ice age and the Great Famine in Northern Europe happens. Again, so we have the dropping temperatures, very unpredictable weather, very wet. A lot of people are dying because you can't grow anything in a field if you can't harvest it. 1337 is the start of the Hundred Years' War. That's when the French king invaded the English-held lands in Gascony, and that was between our Philip IV of Valois and Edward III, the King of England, whose mother was the daughter of the previous French king. Therefore, that's where his claim to the French throne is coming from. So that's 1337. 1347 is when the Black Death Plague arrives in Europe, and that ravages Europe from 1347 to about 1353. 1351 is when England issues the Statute of Laborers, which is telling people you have to stay in your farms, you have to farm the fields that you're used to, you can't demand better rent rates, you have to accept these feudal dues and these obligations. So trying to hold the peasants in their places while the Black Death Plague is still happening. 1353 is the Battle of Portois. That's during the 100 Years' War. And that is when the English had that amazing victory over the French. And they were able to defeat them because of, again, the landscape of the battlefield and the English longbow and inept military planning by the French. 1358 is when we see the French peasants' revolt, the Jacquerie. Again, that is a direct response to demands for larger taxation by the French monarchy and the French peasantry not wanting to pay those taxes when they're having to defend themselves from these roving bands of English chevauchés. So we have the Peasants' Revolt in France in 1358. In 1360, the Treaty of Brittany is signed, and that is when the French king agrees that the English throne can keep the lands in France that they have captured so far, as long as Edward III renounces his claim to the French throne, which he agrees to do. King John is ransomed back to the French. Again, that's why some of that taxes had to be raised, was to pay for that ransom. And then in 1377 is when we see the Great Western Schism, Papal Schism. And that is when we have the one pope who was living in Avignon in France. He moved back to Rome, the traditional, typical home of the papacy. But when he died right away, you have the French clergy electing a pope, and then you've got the Roman Italian clergy electing a pope. And that schism and the fighting that happens between those two popes, they're excommunicating this person, they're excommunicating another person. It's constant fighting back and forth. It really undermines the authority of the church, and it enables monarchies to gain a little bit more power, but it also undermines just normal people's faith in the church's ability to rule. In 1381 is where we see that English peasants' revolt that I just discussed. That's when, Wat Tyler leads the rebels from southern England into London. They attack the house of John of Gaunt. They attack lawyers. They attack the treasury. They attack Flemish cloth traders. And then that revolt spreads across England, and it breaks out in various other cities in the northern parts of England, and it is brutally put down. 1399 is when Henry the Fourth overthrows his cousin, who had been the English king, Richard II. Richard II, of course, was our king during the Peasants' Revolt, the king that all of those peasants wanted to meet with, who told them that he would pardon them and send them home with charters. And so that king, Richard II, was overthrown by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who was the Duke of Lancaster, which is where we get the Lancastrians family in England. About 15 years later, in 1415, is the Battle of Agincourt, where Henry IV's son, who is now Henry V, has that massive victory over the French. And that forces the Treaty of Troyes, or the Treaty of Troyes, to be signed, which makes Henry V the heir to the King of France. So the English king would inherit France after that king of Charles VII dies, or excuse me, Charles VI dies. But of course, Charles VI dies and Henry V dies, and the one person who inherits both thrones is a 9-month-old baby, Henry VI. So in 1429, about another 14 years later, is when Joan of Arc kind of breaks the hold the English have over France. She crowns the French Dauphin and gives the French people someone to rally behind, and really changes the direction of the 100 Years' War. And we see the French being able to push the English out of France permanently. And then in 1453 is where we have that small battle that results in the King of England, Henry VI, going into that catatonic state for about 18 months. And that's sort of our anticlimactic end to the 100 Years' War. But I do want to talk about a couple other things that are happening at this time period. So in 1453, Henry VI, the King of England, falls into that catatonic state. Um, but it's not the only important event that happens in 1453. In 1453, we see the city of Constantinople fall to the Ottoman Turks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what led to that and what the consequences of that were. So Genghis Khan had started the Mongol Empire in 1206. And by 1258, the Mongols had captured that Abbasid Caliphate city of Baghdad. And that was where the power of the Islamic Caliphate was still located, was in Baghdad. And so the power of the Mongols that were installed in that city, they were eventually kind of overcome by new raiders out of the east. Another group of Turks. Remember our Seljuk Turks who kind of took over the Abbasid Caliphate, and they put that pressure on the Byzantines, which then led to the calling of the Crusades. Well, another group comes out of those same Asian steeps, and these are Turks that sort of established their own authority in Asia Minor, and they become known as the Ottoman Turks. And so the Ottoman Turks, like I said, just like the Seljuk Turks before them, start to chip away at the lands of the Byzantine Empire. And by 1314, by 1340, they controlled most of Asia Minor. And then in 1453, the Ottoman Turk Sultan Mehmet II, he's also known as the Magnificent, aged only 20 years old, managed to take the entire city of Constantinople. And so this Christian city, founded by the Roman Emperor Constantine in 324 CE, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, was renamed Istanbul. And this was a huge symbolic loss for Western civilization. If not a huge political loss, because the power of the Byzantine Empire had been waning ever since that disastrous Fourth Crusade that saw the city sacked and pillaged by Christian crusaders in 1204. But the real significance of the fall of Constantinople was the cultural fallout. As I've discussed before, Western Europe had often received injections of culture and learning from interactions with the East, i.e., through the Crusades, through trade, that sort of thing. So when the giant scholarly community in Constantinople realized that they had to flee the city, they fled west, and they fled west into the cities of Europe. With them, in their flight, they brought ancient scrolls and manuscripts that contained knowledge that had not yet spread to Europe. But also within these scrolls and these manuscripts were original versions, or at least older versions of ancient knowledge that had already trickled in to Europe. But if you remember, we don't have, the printing press is only now being created in Europe. But up to this point, the only way you could have copies of a manuscript is for someone to physically make that copy themselves. And I know personally that when I'm writing, sometimes I paraphrase, and sometimes I write the wrong word, or sometimes my handwriting isn't clear and it's not obvious what it is that I'm trying to say. And imagine hundreds and hundreds of years of different people making copies of manuscripts. A lot of those errors are going to be copied and added to. People paraphrase, or they don't understand and they paraphrase incorrectly. And so a lot of the knowledge that Europe had that they believed was directly from these ancient sources, when all of these scholars from Constantinople came in and introduced some of this more pure, more original versions of those works, they realized how wrong those authorities that they had believed for years had been. So think about all of our students who are studying at these medieval universities, and they are sitting in a classroom listening to their lecturer read from a manuscript, and they're all taking notes very furiously, and then suddenly they find out that what they were being told Aristotle had said was actually not Aristotle, or that it had meant something else. And this new information that was being brought into Europe really kind of forced people to start to question some of these ancient authorities. And along with the questioning of those ancient authorities, they start to question the church, because remember that Great Western Schism really undermined people's belief and faith within the church hierarchy itself. It didn't necessarily make them question their faith so much as it made them question the church and what the church was telling them. And so this exodus, this all of this new information that was coming out of Constantinople from these scholars who were fleeing from the city, this exodus from Constantinople helped trigger a cultural phenomenon that in Europe that today we call the Renaissance. We see this as a revival of classical learning, people trying to go to those original sources. And, yes, they acknowledge that they've been reading bad interpretations and bad translations of Socrates and of Plato and Aristotle and Virgil and Livy and all of these ancient Greek and Roman philosophers and scholars that people in medieval Europe had grown to revere and respect so much. They start this revival of classical learning where they're trying to go back to the original sources. We see a revival not just in learning, but in artwork. Imagine all of the beautiful sculptures and paintings and things that had been created in this time period, and writing styles were being promoted as well. We see a revival of poetry and of vernacular language. Latin was such an important language in these universities, but we start seeing the French language becoming important within France, and within English, people are not just writing. They're not just writing in English, but they're publishing in English. And in Italy, the same thing. Italy usually spoke in Latin, but instead now they are writing in Italian, and it becomes this big thing. And people are starting to focus more on humanity rather than on the afterlife. And so this gives a rise to humanism and classical learning. And again, this challenging of these accepted authorities. And all of this is helped by a changing medieval society that's resulted from the Black Death plague, from that drop in population, from the peasants demanding rights and lessening of obligations and that sort of thing. And so we're a bit beyond the scope of this class to really fully discuss the Renaissance, but I really wanted to mention it so that you can kind of make those associations and those connections between what we've learned in this class and what you might learn in later classes, or maybe what you know about the Renaissance, or if you're in an art history class that talks about that, you can kind of understand where those changes were coming from and what kind of helped those changes along. So feel free to read the remaining chapters in the textbook that discuss the Renaissance in greater detail, but that will not be included on the final, and it will not be included on the quiz that you can take after this lecture. Okay. Thank you guys very much. I will be posting a review about the exam coming up, and I will be available for doing an exam review and primary source review probably sometime this weekend. But thank you guys very much, and if you have any questions, just let me know.